Hi everybody, and welcome to our ECOWInd Policy Masterclass. Today, looking at the 5 capitals approach to marine management. It is holiday season at the moment, and I know that many of our academic colleagues are also at sea, so we're not expecting a huge number of people today, but we will be recording this masterclass as normal and putting it on the website. So thank you for those who have come along and who are not yet on holiday. And yes, for those of you who are watching this later on online, I hope you enjoy it. Sam, if you could go to the next slide. So this is one of a series of Policy Masterclass webinars that we've been running for the ECOWInd programme. Today we're going to talk about 5 capitals, and we've got Sam Collin from Halmarin Consulting here to do that. Our next one, which is going to be at the end of July, is going to be on fisheries policy and management. And then after the summer, we're going to be running one on marine net gain, and then running through marine spatial planning. And then we are very fortunate to have Alex Banks coming to talk to us in September about the English seabird conservation and recovery pathway. If you go to the next slide, Sam. So today, as normal, we will have a presentation by Sam, who's going to walk us through some work that HMC did for the Marine Management Organisation, I want to say 12 to 18 months ago. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Sam, myself and Henk. Many of you know Henk is the ECOWInd Programme Manager, but in a previous life he worked in the Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme in JNCC, and also worked with Sam on the 5 capitals project. So I think Sam's going to be talking for 20 or 30 minutes. We've got some panel questions prepared. As we go through, if you've got questions for Sam, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will take those at the end as well. Brilliant. Over to you, Sam.
Okay, thanks, Dickon, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for calling in. So for my presentation, I'm going to be providing an introduction to the 5 capitals approach, and I'm going to be focusing largely on a project we did for the MMO last year, where we were asked to investigate further the potential for the 5 capitals approach for informing marine planning decisions, in particular trade-offs between sectors. So I'm going to start by just giving an introduction, starting with natural capital, and this is a term that's been become more ubiquitous in terms of marine planning, how we manage our environment, and how we begin to capture the benefits the environment provides for society. So natural capital is the world's stocks of natural assets, which include geology, soil, air, water, and all living things. So essentially the environment around us. And from these natural capital assets, they provide a number of ecosystem services. So in this diagram, those are pollination, biomass, and water purification. But we can also include things like carbon sequestration, and thinking about blue carbon habitats are certainly an area of interest at the moment when talking about marine protected areas and conservation. And so when we combine ecosystem services with other forms of capital, so these are things like human, social, and manufactured capital, they provide goods and services. And those goods and services include things like food, fiber, clean water, and recreation. And it's those goods and services that provide benefits to society and changes in human welfare. And so that kind of provides the linear route of natural capital from assets through to benefits to society. But this talk is really about how natural capital integrates with these other forms of capital, and how a better understanding of those interactions and those assets associated with other capitals can help inform decision making. And so this is where we move on to the 5 capitals approach. And the 5 capitals are natural capital. We have social capital, which is really about societal groups, communities, schools, and businesses. We have human capital, which really focuses more on the individual, so health, skills, and motivations required for a productive economy. We have financial capital, which is, as you would expect, to the economic measure of value. And then last, we have manufactured capital, which is materials and goods, so essentially the built environment around us. And by looking through these different these 5 different capitals, we can begin to look at environmental value, social value, and economic value, these being the 3 pillars of sustainability. So the 5 capitals approach was first articulated by Jonathan Porritt in 2005 in the Forum for the Future. And this focused really on businesses and organizations and how you can look at the assets within an organization under these 5 capitals to inform how you make decisions on the running of that organization. Is it being managed sustainably and effectively? And while consideration for human capital, natural capital, and financial capital might have been taken on board like traditionally when looking at a business, what makes a 5 capitals approach different from those is that you start to look at more at the interactions between these different assets across capitals and how impacting one of these assets may lead on to knock-on effects to the other assets. So it's taking a much more systems approach to organization management. And there are other forms of multiple capital approaches. So the Capitals Coalition, a coalition of over 400 organizations, has a 4 capitals approach where they don't include financial capital, where it's seen more as a product of the other capitals. And there's also a 6 capitals model, which includes intellectual capital, and this links more to integrated reporting for public sector and business accounts. And we felt that the intellectual capital wasn't really relevant for what we were looking at, so we've focused much more on the 5 capitals approach. So as mentioned earlier, I'm going to be presenting the findings from a project we did for the MMO, myself and Henk, that concluded a year ago. And we were asked to look at the potential for the 5 capitals approach to inform decision-making and trade-offs, specifically within the East Marine Plan area. We were asked to focus on fisheries, marine aggregates, and offshore renewables, the 3 key sectors, I think linked largely to the growth of offshore renewables within the marine plan area and the challenges with trade-offs over use of space. In looking at the application of the 5 capitals approach, we were asked to develop an asset register, and I'll talk through what that is. We then used that information to create asset network diagrams, which I'll talk through as well, and then at the end to develop a conceptual framework around how can we actually take this information and this approach and apply it to integrate it into decision making. And then the last bit I'm going to touch on is how we can use this information to inform different scenarios to help inform decisions around trade-offs. So firstly, looking at asset registers. So these are essentially a stock take of the capital assets. And the key in that sense is being able to quantify the different assets in a defined point in time and over a defined scale. And this really provides detailed information on the condition of these assets. And I'll show you a screenshot of what that looks like in the next slide. But there are a number of considerations and restraints we came across while developing this. It was essentially a spreadsheet of assets. And that is that the information you collect is a snapshot in time. And if you want to use an asset register to inform decisions and management decisions over time, you'll need to update it periodically, and there's a cost and resource implication with that. Whilst developing our asset register, we relied completely on information that was publicly available. And there's a whole range of information that's privately held that you may need to purchase. But what we were able to do is identify data gaps. And when you identify data gaps, there's then a question around, right, is this a key data gap? Do we need to fund new assessments to fill that data gap? Scale is really important in this piece of work. And when looking at data availability, there's a big question, right? Is the data available at the scale needed? Is it suitable or appropriate for answering the question we're trying to address? If it's available at a national scale and you're focusing on a regional scale, can this information be disaggregated and still be beneficial and inform your work? And then lastly, comparability across sectors. You'll find some sectors are very data rich, which is great, but others are data poor. And how do we address those differences? So this is a busy slide. but it's just to give you a snapshot of what an asset register looks like. So on the left, we have our three sectors, fishing, renewables, and aggregates. That's next to those, the next 5 columns are different capitals. And then on the right, there's the information about the asset and its condition. And we designed this spreadsheet essentially so that you could filter through the different sectors and the different capitals to focus in on, say, what are the natural capital assets associated with the fishing sector? Or if there are assets that are linked to multiple sectors, which are those assets? Because those are going to be quite important assets. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's some cells that have got red text in it, and these really identify data gaps. And there's then, as I mentioned earlier, then there's discussion around how important is this data? Do we need to fund research to fill this data gap? Or are there other ways of addressing these data gaps? So this is a way of collecting all the information we can around different assets associated with sectors, capitals, and their condition. But once we've collected all that information, what do we then do with it? And one of the key things we wanted to do is move away from this data-heavy spreadsheet into something more visual that's easier to kind of understand how all these assets link together and visualize it more as a system rather than a spreadsheet. And so you could do that by mapping it out spatially on a map, but we developed this kind of schematic diagram called an asset network. And in developing this network, these diagrams, we wanted to be able to associate capitals with these different assets. We wanted to identify the relationships between assets. We wanted to identify important assets and also linkages between the different sectors. Again, coming back to these shared assets, what are the key links that bring them together? And so in my next slide, I'm just going to kind of talk through the process of building up one of these asset network diagrams. And I'm going to start with the offshore renewable sector. So on the right-hand side, we have our key. So you've got your 5 different capitals: human, social, natural, manufactured, and financial. And then we use our asset register to start building up these diagrams. So starting with wind turbines, your manufactured asset, and there are links to natural capital there through wind, the use of the seafloor, and the construction materials to build that turbine. Building on from that, we have more manufactured assets. So at the bottom, you have your offshore and onshore substations, you have cabling, and you have your operations and maintenance vessels. Building on from there, at the bottom, you obviously have the energy that you're collecting from wind and transferring. You have your human capital in the middle. So these are all the employees and the people and their training qualifications required to operate all of this manufactured capital. And at the top, you have your harbour and port. And we've built in like this financial capital link there, where if you have operations and maintenance vessels, there's going to be berthing costs for using that harbour and port. So just give them an indication of how you can build in financial capital. And then stemming off from the employees working in this sector, you'll have things like income tax, disposable income, and then links to the local community. And obviously disposable income could be spent in that local community, but also employees either could live in that local community and build up the social capital in that sense. And then lastly, moving along from the energy, you have the energy sold on the market, and then you have a sector community. So thinking of all the energy companies that operate within that sector, there's financial value associated with that energy, and then there's the national grid, manufactured capital for transporting that energy around the country. So by building these diagrams, you can start to see how each of the different capitals fit into this system and link to this sector. And you can start to build an understanding of how these assets interact and are related to one another, and how potentially changes in one of these assets could have implications for a number of different assets within the system. And you'll notice that employment, harbour and port, and local community are these dashed circles. And that's to indicate that these are shared assets with other sectors. So these are really important links to beyond the offshore wind sector. And so if I move on to the next one, this is the similar process for developing the marine aggregates. So you have marine sand and gravel as your natural capital asset that's establishes the foundations of the system. You have manufactured assets like vessels and harbour and port. And in this case, you have the aggregates that are landed, go to market, and then go to aggregate processing. So you have a couple more stages, and therefore more opportunities for employing links to human capital. But that's still a fairly simple system. If we move on to the fisheries sector, this is a bit more complex, but again, it follows a similar process of you have your natural capital at the foundations of the system, so fish spawning grounds and nursery areas that links to fish stocks. And then from that, you have fishing vessels, your manufactured capital, you have your fish landings, they go to the market. At the bottom of this diagram, there's a social capital associated with the market, then the product of fish being sold and that going to supporting fish tourism or seafood processing. And again, this human capital, these employees linked to all of these different components of the system. But what makes fishing sector slightly different from the other sectors is at the top of this this diagram, there's a much stronger presence of social capital linked with the fishing community. So things like fisheries associations, the culture and traditions associated with the fishing sector. And this is obviously linked to the local community. So again, by mapping out these assets and linking them to these different capitals, you could begin to see not just how capitals fit into the system, but how the presence and importance of capitals changes depending on the sector you're looking at. So now that we've built our asset registers, we've got the information about the asset register, the different capital assets, and we've started to build these systems to think about how they interact and how they function alongside each other. The next task was like, how do we use this information to inform decision making? And this is where the next step was to develop this kind of conceptual framework. And this is just a hypothetical approach, but it's a way we think you could integrate 5 capitals into decision making. And it considers things like environmental, social, and economic factors key for sustainability. So this is our framework. There are 4 key stages. And I'll quickly talk through those 4 stages. So stage 1, which is really key around defining the question you're asking. You know, what is the area of interest? What are the sectors that operate within that space? And what are the key priorities, policy priorities, sector priorities for that area? Once that's established, you can move to stage 2, where it's essentially building your asset register. And the first part informs what kind of information you want to collect, what information is really key, and which sectors you want to focus on. And once you've developed your asset register, you move on to stage 3, which is where this process becomes a bit more complex and a bit more interesting, in that we start to bring in more stakeholder and expert participation into building those asset network diagrams, identifying what assets are key, which are the most important one, what are the interactions, how, and on top of that, we're starting to think about, well, how do we value these assets, you know, to inform trade-offs? And traditionally, we've been we look at economic values as a way to do this. But when we start to look at a lot of the assets within the 5 capitals approach, particularly around social capital assets, you can't really capture those in monetary values. And so, putting monetary values aside, we propose using a kind of a relative value approach to valuing these assets. So using the stakeholders and technical support, potentially in a workshop setting, thinking about, you know, how important is this asset compared to this asset compared to this asset, and building this relative value to try and help move the discussion along to inform decisions. And once you start to assign values to these assets, you can start to have discussions around, well, what are the limits here? This asset might be impacted. What is the lowest we want this asset to be degraded by, if degraded at all? Where are the opportunities for growth, and what are the interactions between assets that can really deliver that growth? And so once you've gone through that process, then we move to stage 4. And this is where the information is handed to the decision makers, and they use that information to develop scenarios and do some scenario modeling to explore different trade-offs. And then finally, that information is used to support and inform ultimately the final decision on how you move forward and how we manage our environment. And so the next slide, I'm gonna just touch a bit on this kind of scenario modeling component of it, and how we see you might be able to think about the 5 capitals in terms of scenario modeling. And so this slide is really looking at the stage 3 and stage 4 of that conceptual framework. So in stage 3, we've got our stakeholder participation for developing these asset networks, assigning relative values to these assets, identifying key interactions between those assets, and again, looking at opportunities for growth and development, and identifying limitations and thresholds to inform trade-offs. So once you've got these relative values, we can then begin to kind of map these out. So these are the like collective values essentially of, say, natural capital within the aggregate sector, or financial capital within the aggregate sector, human capital in renewable sector. And this gives us a kind of a status quo of hypothetical values. And you'll see on this graph that there are these red lines, and these could be limits that you don't want that capital asset or those values to drop below. And so the kind of red lines like, right, this is what we have, and we're going to use these limits to inform trade-offs. And so once you have these hypothetical values, you can then run different scenarios. And so we've got 3 different scenarios here around offshore wind development. The top scenario is that you meet your policy targets. So offshore renewables expands. So on the graph, you can see the human capital, manufactured capital, and financial capital go up in renewables as we increase the amount of offshore renewables. But you'll see that it may have an impact on fisheries through restricting access to fishing grounds, and you may see a drop in the human, social, manufactured, and financial capital of the fisheries sector. And it may be that it doesn't necessarily affect the aggregate sector at the moment, because they're quite flexible in where they can go. But then scenario 2, we're looking at exceeding that policy target, and you're maximizing the amount of offshore wind you can develop. And you'll see there'll be a much bigger impact on fisheries through greater restrictions on where fishermen can fish, but it may also start to encroach on the aggregate sector and reductions in opportunities for aggregate production. And the last scenario is looking at an 80% of the policy target. So renewables expands, but not as much as the other 2 scenarios, but the impact on fisheries is less. So through this process, it can begin to help you think about the wider implications of decisions and trade-offs in marine space in particular. So in summary, through this approach, we feel that there's a lot of potential here to help inform decision making, and to take this much more comprehensive view of the implications of marine planning decisions. What's really key and interesting about this approach is that it's question driven. It's quite flexible. It can be applied at different scales. It can be applied at policy targets, specific trade-offs, or even at like proposed developments of, for example, a salmon farm proposal. What are the impacts of that through this 5 capitals approach? It brings together a varied range of evidence and a range of stakeholders into the process to inform it, and it provides this opportunity for transparent decision making through that stakeholder participation in assigning values and identifying interactions and limits and growth opportunities. And it can inform complex issues like carrying capacity, values, and trade-offs. But really key here is that it's not a silver bullet. It can't make that decision for you, but it can be a valuable tool in understanding the implications of decisions and helping to inform that decision ultimately. So my last slide is focusing a bit more on just like, how can the research community help with this process? So I presented quite a high level view of the 5 capitals approach and its application. But when you get into the details of it, that's where there are a lot of more challenges, particularly around things like assigning relative values to assets. There are many ways of doing this. What's the most effective approach? Who do we need in the room when assigning those relative values? Is there a better approach? Secondly, understanding the different scales at which the capitals operate. This is most starkly evident with social capital, which is really powerful at the size of a community. So a local community, there's a very strong social capital, but does it apply at a national scale? And then lastly, data to inform asset registers. There will be gaps in data, understanding which data is the most important, and how do we focus investment into filling those data gaps. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll hand back over to Dickon.
Thanks, Sam. That was really, really interesting. And I think Henk has put a copy of the 5 Capitals report in the chat. Henk, for those people that are looking at this at a later date, they can find that online as well, can't they?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we've got some time for discussion, and Lucy's got a comment in the chat, which is really teed us up for our first question. Actually, Lucy's asked about valuation, and said you must have to collect a representative set of stakeholders to ensure a fairness to this valuation. How do you make sure that everyone's included? How are values weighted in decision making or in scenario building? And is this done through expert opinion? And Sam, when we were preparing for this, we talked about a kickoff question for this being about how do we assign values in this approach, and how is it different from other approaches? And how do we use those values to quantify interactions, which I think feeds into some of what Lucy's asking there. Sam, I'm going to come to you first, and then Henk, you afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah, so this was a real challenge we had when doing this piece of work, because you can collect all this information about these assets. It's all in different metrics, and how do we kind of standardize that in a way that can inform decision making? And we went through a number of different approaches, and we felt that the best way to do it was to try and assign relative value. And it's really important when doing that, you get the right stakeholders in. And I think you need people from across different sectors. You need people from the communities that are going to be affected by these decisions. But also you need that technical expert opinion, social scientists, environmental scientists, etc., that can really provide that more expert input into how to go about valuing these different assets, because it's a broad range of disciplines that we're pulling together here, and so you need this quite a wide range of expertise to inform that. But ultimately, it's really done on a case-by-case basis, and you just need to, we can't take the values created by one group in one scenario and then just transfer them over to a different case. And therefore it's quite there's a lot of stakeholder engagement. It is resource intensive to do this. But that's one of the key questions that came out of this. Like we've said, yeah, relative values would be the best approach, but we don't know yet the best way of doing that. I'll hand over to Henk.
Yeah, Henk, have you got anything else you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Well, first to say thanks, Sam, for presenting that again, and thank you, Lucy, for a great question. These are the kind of questions, Lucy, that we asked ourselves in the project team, and went round and round in circles around the best way of doing this. So it is a very important question. When it comes to valuation, we trawled through different valuation approaches. We did find that there are environmental valuation approaches, and there's a lot of research on that, and there are disagreements in how that's done as well. So you've got variability in how you would evaluate environmental assets. There are also financial evaluation systems that we're all quite familiar with. These are in our news an awful lot. It's often how our economy runs based on those evaluations. And then there are social evaluation systems. And these seem to be the three broad categories. And in bringing those all together, ideally, you'd want to have one single metric under which you could compare and contrast everything. And when we weighed that up, in addition to the need to bring in stakeholders, people who have a stake in that particular question or decision, you want to get as much of their buy-in and expertise in this problem as possible. And so when you bring in the need for valuation, but you also bring in the need to have a diverse group of stakeholders, as Sam has outlined, you then begin to ask yourself, well, can you arrive at a single metric? Is it appropriate to use a single metric? And the conclusion after many roundtables that we came to was that in this approach, you would be asking the stakeholders to decide on their own relative valuation that is informed by the evidence, informed by the science, and they as a group of people would then have to come up with a valuation system. Now, the system that Sam illustrated, we went for was a 1 to 10 scale, just because it's easy to illustrate. But let's say in that situation, you could get those group of experts, each an expert in their own right around this particular issue, to agree on a system of 1 to 10. And then you've got a really interesting, you're at an interesting point then, because if you can get to that point, then you begin to sort of then make decisions, as you pointed out in your question, based on expert opinion, but you can fast track a lot of the academic inconsistencies that are in all the literature, and you can arrive at a simpler, more agile system that you could apply across a whole wide range of management challenges. So it's a very complex thing. We thought long and hard about it, and as Sam didn't point out, it was only a 2-month project, this. So we had to come up with an approach quite quickly, and yeah, it's open for debate.
Yeah. So Heck, this isn't a question that we discussed yesterday, but it's one that we've discussed in the HMC team many times, that I think you touched on a little bit at the end there. Given that this is a qualitative approach to some degree, and obviously we use some quantitative data as well, over the last few years, natural capital is sort of the new kid on the block, and people have been looking at it at all levels of decision making, from regulatory decisions like licensing that it could end up in court, for example, and need tough compliance associated with them, to the other end, strategic decision making around either strategic assessment of sectoral plans at sea, or policy making, or like those kind of broader kind of scale things. Within this approach, and this is a question for both of you, at what level do you think it works most effectively? That's for either of you, really. I don't know which one of you want to go first.
I can make a start, I guess. So I think with this 5 capitals approach, you can make it as complicated as you want. You can operate it, you can build and build and build and make it a huge scale with every single detail about every single asset. And there's this element of where, it becomes so complicated that it becomes less useful. And my feeling is that if you're going to apply this approach, it should be kept as simple as possible. And I think that's where it has the most power. And I think in those cases, either the question has to be very straightforward and simple, and you can look at that across an East Marine Plan area, for example. So it was like trade-off between offshore wind and fisheries in this area, right? Yeah. Focus on that. If you wanted to broaden it out to look at multiple, like 6-7 different sectors around how you manage that whole area, then it becomes really complicated. But I think there's also a lot of application here where it could be around a specific planning decision. As I mentioned, they talk about, so for example, aquaculture development that is very focused. It'll have an immediate impact around the communities around it, and it's quite contained, and there's a limited number of assets and interactions. It's quite easier to manage. So I feel it could have quite a powerful role there.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yes, I'd agree with that as well, Sam. And I mean, if you think of it as an approach that you can scale, how in your scaling, when you set that initial question, you would then bring in evidence according to that scale. You would invite stakeholders to participate according to that scale, and then the outcome should be appropriate at that scale too. And so it's I think in answer to your question, Dick, and I think it can work at at a more strategic, wider scale, but it can also work at a more local scale. It all depends on how you set that question. However, the complexity of the approach, over a much larger scale, you would need to be very careful. And as Sam has pointed out, the aim is to make the complex simple. So over a much larger application, say you're applying it over, a whole marine plan area or a whole sea basin, there's enormous complexity there. The value of this approach is you could simplify an awful lot of the complexity there. But you would need to be very careful with which bits you simplify and which bits you keep the pointy details in.
And I guess, Hank, Sam, so where you have decision making that's looking to have facets that are environmental, facets that are social, facets that are economic, this is really useful. And I know that the Crown Estate are more and more looking in offshore wind leasing to build in things like supply chain, so sustainability in supply chain, thing called fiscal flow, which is like where is the money flowing to and how's it going into local communities, and trying to bring those into decision making on leasing for offshore wind. Again, it's a really difficult thing because you've kind of got apples and pears in some instance, and so having a framework within which you can consider those is really valuable, isn't it?
Yeah. If I can add to that, those, I think those approaches are great, Dick. And I've heard about Crown Estate work in that area, and I'd love to open up Lucy's question to them as well, to hear about how they got over some of their valuation challenges, or whether they did or not, because I think they went for a single metric, as their approach. And it is great that we're living in an era where a wider number of concerns are coming into decision making, and of those, we do see natural capital approaches gaining a lot of traction across government, and we do see them an awful lot in academia. Indeed, they're also mentioned a few times in the ECOWInd projects. There are quite a few. The ECOWInd projects have natural capital components. It's when you get quite far into the process, you begin to realize, as you said, that you do have a lot of apples and pears, and a lot of different metrics and things that are really hard to bring together. I think one of the things that we came across with this particular piece of work was that we believed as a team it wasn't appropriate to bring things all together, that actually some things just should be kept separate. And this is where that relative valuation approach was actually quite well. It was a compromise. It was a compromise, a way of pushing things forward. And I wonder, are there other efforts out there that we see, other research efforts, other management efforts, where people are getting sort of stuck in the forest, just around, can't see the wood for the trees. They're so het up on trying to arrive at a really great system for valuation or decision making or asset register development, whereas arguably a simpler, more fleet approach might be a way forward. Have you got any thoughts on that, Sam?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the adaptability of the 5 capitals approach and the process of developing the registers and the network diagrams allows for things like supply chains to be incorporated. It can really be adapted to the question you're answering. It doesn't necessarily have to focus just on marine. It can incorporate a whole range of different components that support answering whatever the question is you're you're addressing. So yeah, I just say that the flexibility in it enables it to be really informative.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. We've got a question from Dave in the chat, which actually it's almost like the people attending have seen the list of questions that we developed earlier. We had a question about the fact that network asset diagrams are great but quite simple, and we wondered like how can these be developed further to include different facets from different capitals or indeed different flows of value. And Dave's built on that, saying a really useful presentation, report looks great. Can I ask about the offshore renewables map? The output capitals seem to be just financial, manufactured and social linked to jobs. Should we not also incorporate the feedback to natural capital and human capital, given that the push for renewables is to mitigate the climate crisis and all the harms to natural capital and human capital that come from this? The harm from climate change from lower or higher offshore wind would need to be added into your scenario modelling of impacts on all sectors. So again, Dave, just expanding on that question that we were talking about yesterday. Sam, I wonder if you want to give you some of your thoughts on like how can the network asset maps be developed? They're obviously quite simple at the moment. Yeah, but interested to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to a lot of the question, particularly around things like climate change, you can develop your asset registers, but it's when you get to that scenario building exercise, it's when you start to put, the impacts of climate change. How would that affect this network of assets, this system? So to give an example, I mean, we start to see the 5 capitals in a lot of the work we do, like just through going through this process of developing these networks. And I was discussing climate adaptive fisheries, how do fisheries adapt to climate change? And so there are scenarios within that you could set up your network on the fisheries sector and think, right, okay, well, if this fish stock moves further north, does the fishing sector travel further, or does the fishing sector move further north? If a new species comes in and you have to adapt all the fishing approaches and equipment, what are the implications of that? And so with questions around climate change, you can definitely build those into the scenario building. But yeah, I think, again, we quite in a very short period of time just developed this idea and like put these asset network diagrams together to be indicative of how you could build a network. But as I say, you can add in as much detail as you want, or as little detail you can add. You can focus it around what the question needs, and they're very flexible in that sense. So yeah, it's possible definitely to incorporate those components.
Thanks, Sam. Hank, have you got any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, but just to add that we did think about that as well, Dave. The network diagrams can be they can be as complex as you like, and I myself are quite fond of the details, and I'm quite fond of feedback loops, and dabbled a little bit in ecological modeling in a past life. So I mean, I see where your thoughts are going there, and you can make these as complicated, as you like, as you can conceive, but you've also got to weigh up that complexity with the stakeholder group that you're going to be working with, and are they going to be able to understand, and are they going to be able to work with the decision-making framework that you've put together under a 5 capitals approach. So in weighing those things up again, what you might do in this approach is develop a really detailed, complex asset network map, but then you might have to produce the top copy that summarizes that only picks the most important components, the most important assets that need to be discussed in those discussions. And I think it's really, you raise an important point there, and often these details, if they're important enough, they'll make it into that final cut. That would be how I would handle that one.
Can I just quickly add into that? When you start adding in more complex interactions and more details, there's a question around confidence in what that produces at the end. the more complexity you build in, maybe more assumptions you build in, and then how much confidence do you really have at the end product to inform a decision. And so by keeping it as simple as possible, you can build that more confidence in what's actually produced at the end.
Yeah, it's that layering, isn't it? In anything that we do, whether you're doing ecological cumulative effects assessment or ecosystem modeling or whatever it is, the more layers you have, that compound uncertainty, and the more qualitative things are, that compound uncertainty will propagate through a system, won't it? So we talked yesterday, and again, it comes into kind of, I guess, testing some of that uncertainty. How do you test a network scenario? And this, I guess, goes a little bit back to Lucy's question, but also the question from Dave. So how are you sense checking them to make sure they're informative for decision making? And how are you making sure that you, particularly when you're thinking about flow, about how different capitals are responding to different situations, and how do we sort of understand that? Because different capitals will respond in different ways. Sam, yesterday you were talking about how different capitals respond to being used, for example, and so, like, trying to make sure that all of those things work well. And I know that when you were developing this for the MMO, it was very much a theoretical framework rather than I'm going to actually then try and drive data through it. I just wonder if you've got any sort of reflections on, like, making this operational, making sure it makes sense, like understanding how the network behaves, I guess.
I guess I could just come in quickly in terms of clarifying around how the capitals vary in terms of how they're used, and there's quite an important distinction between them because they don't all function in the same way or respond to use in the same way. So, for example, if we looked at a natural capital asset, we know that if we use that asset sustainably, we can maintain its value and continue its use in a renewable sense. But if we use it too much, then the value of that asset will decrease and the benefits we get from that will decrease as well. So there's a question about, allowing assets to recover and managing them sustainably, and allowing them to recover means to leave them alone, essentially. Whereas if we looked at social capital, the more you use social capital, the more valuable it becomes. So if you think about a community group or a church, for example, if one person goes to the church and then that church closes, it affects one person. But if the whole community goes to that church, its social value is really high, and therefore closing it would be really impactful on that community. So it's important to think about how these capitals respond to use and lack of use as well. And so in terms of trialing it and assessing how we go about developing these scenarios, there's a really key thing here around getting a better understanding of how these assets interact, and clarifying what those interactions are. And they could be feedback loops, they could be one directional, but getting that expert opinion into that to building that confidence into the model. But beyond that, I think it's a really difficult one, and it may be a case of when there is a decision being made, a planning decision, maybe run this exercise alongside it to see how well it captures what happens later on, and just going through this trial and error approach of refining the stakeholder engagement, the development of these network diagrams, and the valuation approach to inform scenarios, and try and stress test that against real situations when they're happening. I know, Henk, have you got additional thoughts on that? It was a tricky one to
It is, and it was as we were doing this project with the team, Sam. I mean, broadly, you could break the whole approach down into three steps. The first step is gathering the information around that question, and it's that evidence base. That's what you give to this stakeholder group, which is the second big step. And in that second step, you're relying a lot on the stakeholders' expertise in understanding how a scenario might play out and championing their particular capitals that they're representing or their interests. And so, if it's the effect of a new marine protected area, say, you'll have people saying for and against that and what sort of impacts are likely to be. And so you're relying a lot on the evidence base that comes from that first bit, but also people's expert understanding of how that evidence base and their experience of these matters, how that would play out. And you're bringing that into how the scenarios might play out. The third step, which we've not spoken much about, is, it's a validation step. And that's where this is handed back to the decision makers. And then they ultimately have to weigh up everything that comes out of that, that process. So as Sam said, I would recommend running this alongside an actual process just to see how it fares.
Yeah. Okay, great. We've got one more question from Lucy that we can probably take in the last 9 minutes. She says, the network diagrams are built to summarize a complex system and their interactions. Are there any surprising feedbacks or emergent properties that come out from these network models, or are they a straight reflection of how they're built? So that's a really interesting question around expert judgment. Like, what you know, don't you? But getting people from different backgrounds together, and we're recently doing some system mapping work for DEFRA, where we're looking across the full ocean policy system, and you get people from different areas together and you start building those kind of maps, and you realize that you've got two people from disparate areas who are interested in the same thing, and you generate new connections, don't you? But that's slightly different because we're talking about system mapping. But when we're looking at network models, did you find when you were doing it that you got emergent things coming out that surprised you?
Yeah, so I think when we were workshopping these approaches during the project, as expected, you have these like natural capital assets that really form the starting point of these systems. But one thing that kind of came out and was pointed out by a social scientist in one of the workshops was that it was really interesting how human capital in all of these diagrams tended to be the focal in the center of the diagram and links to everything. And there's like, it just highlights the importance of human capital in all of this as well. Because we tend to focus on like the natural capital, economics and societal kind of impacts. But actually the individuals, the human capital, the qualifications, the number of people, resources in that sense is really central to all the components within the system. So I think that was quite an interesting take, which I hadn't really recognized when putting them together.
Do you know what, Sam? There's something in marine as well that I think a lot of marine policy and management is a bunch of natural scientists trying to do stuff that isn't natural science. And in my career, I've often looked across at what's going on in like education and transport and energy, where you've got people from different backgrounds doing tackling similar problems in different ways. And it's a similar thing, isn't it? That multidisciplinary approach always throws up different perspectives, which are really interesting. Henk, have you got any reflections of going through that process?
I really like your observation, Sam. I think that's brilliant. It is very much people are at the center of all this. What jumped out for me were the common assets across all the systems. So obviously people are common in all of that, but the value of the local community and the role of our harbors and ports. I think harbors and ports came up as a common feature. The environment, although we didn't list the environment in our models as a common feature, it's actually kind of at the crux of a lot of this, is that the environment is this huge common resource that is there, and it's very, very complicated, and we are extracting different types of resources in different ways from it. And I think that if we could go back and sort of reclassify those, I think sort of calling a lot of the environmental resources common, the environmental assets, calling those common resources as well, I think could be quite an interesting way of looking at that and stressing adding more stress to the importance of those elements in the system.
Great. Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Sam. We're drawing to a close, so I think, unless there's any final comments that you'd like to make, either of you, before we close.
I would just say that I think this was quite an exploratory piece of work for us, and we kind of really delved into it, not knowing much about it. And now that we've gone through this process of researching it and thinking it through in terms of decision making, our mindset is now 5 capitals when we're working on a whole range of different stuff. And I'd just say I think there is a lot of real potential with this approach to inform decision making. And it's just, I hope that more work comes from this, moving it forward, because as I say, we see it everywhere we work at the moment.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sam. And Hank, there's one last question coming for you just before we close. Well, you were talking about commonalities there, and Dave's asked, is another commonality that all assets depend on the climate crisis being mitigated, which obviously requires the energy transition, of which offshore wind is a significant component. We talked about thresholds, didn't we? About, like, you set your policy targets as thresholds, and in that instance, you could talk about what's my policy target for mitigating climate change, and then that's the bounds of the system. Am I right in thinking that's how you sort of deal with some of those commonalities?
Yeah, I think I think Dave's got a good point. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis as well. They're they underpin everything really.
Cost of living crisis, which is then the policy trilemma, right there.
Yeah, there you go. Sort of, I don't know fully, Dave, whether those are completely factored into all decision making, though. So maybe they should be, and maybe an approach like this could be a way that we could shoehorn that in. So it's higher up in the agenda. Yeah.
Well, Brave New World and all that. So yeah, we'll watch this space.
On that bombshell, yeah.
And on that bombshell, yeah. I'd just like to remind everybody that we've got Fisheries Policy Masterclass on the 28th of July. Again, that will be recorded so we can put it online. I would like to thank everybody for turning up. And for those of you that are listening online later date, I hope you found it really useful. My immense thanks to Sam for preparing the presentation and walking us through it, and to Hank and Sam for being part of the panel. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you all. Bye.